The air in Saratoga was thick with anticipation. It was September 19, 1777, and the world watched as American rebels braced themselves for a clash that would set the tone of the Revolutionary War. A British force, led by the determined General John Burgoyne, was attempting a massive push southward, intending to slice through New York and isolate New England from the other colonies. They called it the Divide and Conquer Plan. But what Burgoyne didn't expect was a brutal fight in the quiet, rugged expanse of Freeman's farm. Now the Americans weren't exactly sitting ducks. Leading the Continental Army was General Horatio Gates, a careful and methodical man, a stark contrast to his fiery second-in-command, Benedict Arnold, whose aggressive bravery often brought him either disaster or glory. The Americans had their eyes peeled, knowing that this was their chance to stop Burgoyne's advance, to keep the colonies connected, and to ultimately prove to the world, especially to France, who was still on the fence about backing them, that they could stand against one of the world's most powerful armies. The battle began as Burgoyne's army advanced with two wings, the main column marching down the road toward Albany, with a detachment swinging wide to Freeman's farm. Burgoyne, confident in his numbers, believed his well-disciplined redcoats, Hessian mercenaries and indigenous allies could overpower any American resistance. And with them were artillery, gleaming in the sun, seemingly invincible. But as the British moved in, they met more than they bargained for. Sharpshooters from the famed Daniel Morgan's Rifle Corps took up positions in the trees, picking off officers and creating chaos. Burgoyne's men expected to march straight through, but were met with bullets flying from unseen shooters. The Americans weren't fighting the way the British were used to. There were no rigid lines, no predictable formations. They were ambushed from the shadows. As the British line pressed forward, the Americans, around 4,000 strong, were bolstered by a hidden weapon, Benedict Arnold. Known for his wild courage and combat instincts, Arnold urged Gates to be more aggressive, to push hard and meet the British head-on. Gates was hesitant, but Arnold convinced him to send in troops to disrupt the British line. The scene at Freeman's farm was like a pressure cooker. The two armies collided in waves of blood, smoke, and cannon fire. The British had the upper hand in terms of numbers and discipline, but the Americans fought like they were defending their homes, because in a way they were. Burgoyne pushed forward, but his men couldn't see the enemy clearly, thanks to Morgan's sharpshooters disrupting every inch they gained. Arnold was relentless, moving his men through the woods, refusing to give up an inch without a fight. Even as the British managed to form lines and launch counterattacks, Arnold's men wouldn't break. They hid behind trees, firing and then vanishing before the British could retaliate. Every time Burgoyne thought he'd gained ground, he'd find his men in disarray again, facing a fresh volley from an unseen enemy. And that was the power of the terrain. Freeman's farm wasn't just a battlefield, it was a series of natural defenses for the Americans. The forest, the hills, the creeks, it was a perfect environment for guerrilla warfare, and Arnold knew it. Gates, watching from behind, saw Arnold's tactics working, and for once he held back his hesitations, letting Arnold do what he did best. By late afternoon, Burgoyne was feeling the strain. His forces were taking heavy losses, especially among the officers. Daniel Morgan's riflemen were picking off anyone who looked like they might be in charge, and without their leaders, the British soldiers were starting to lose heart. Burgoyne ordered a full attack, hoping to crush the Americans in one decisive blow, but Arnold had anticipated this. He rallied his men, moving them like pieces on a chessboard. Every time the British advanced, Arnold's forces slipped away, only to reappear in new, unexpected positions. Arnold himself was in the thick of it, his voice booming over the noise, urging his men to hold fast. It was a reckless bravery, the kind that makes legends or martyrs. And then came the moment that changed everything. As the British began to waver, Arnold saw his chance. He led a furious charge, crashing into the British flank. The sudden assault shocked Burgoyne's men, and for a moment they faltered. The Americans pushed harder, forcing the British to give ground. Freeman's farm became a battleground of desperation, neither side willing to retreat, both sides soaked in sweat and blood, their fates hanging in the balance. As night fell, the fighting finally subsided. Burgoyne's army had held onto the field, but barely. The British had lost around 600 men, the Americans around 300, and the ground at Freeman's farm was littered with fallen soldiers and abandoned equipment. Technically, the British had won the battle, but it was a hollow victory. Their ranks were thinned, their supplies dwindling, and their morale shaken. Burgoyne's confidence was replaced by a grim realization. He was deep in enemy territory with no reinforcements and facing an enemy that wouldn't back down. Arnold, though furious that Gates didn't follow up with a full assault, knew the Americans had won something far more valuable: psychological advantage. They'd proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with the British, that they could outthink and outfight them on their own turf. Freeman's farm was more than a battle, it was a statement, a declaration that the Continental Army wasn't going anywhere, and the British, for all their strength, weren't invincible. As word spread, the morale among the American forces soared, while British support at home began to waver. Freeman's farm wasn't the end, but it was a crucial chapter in the story of American independence, setting the stage for the eventual surrender at Saratoga, the moment that convinced France to join the fray, and the beginning of the end for British rule in the colonies. In the days that followed, Freeman's farm became a symbol of American resilience. It wasn't just about who held the field, but about who was willing to sacrifice everything for a cause. Benedict Arnold, despite his later betrayal, was a hero that day, and his daring tactics became the stuff of legend. Freeman's farm showed the world that the Americans weren't just a ragtag group of rebels. They were a force to be reckoned with, fighting not for a king or a flag, but for the right to determine their own fate. Burgoyne, realizing he'd underestimated the Americans, would go on to make increasingly desperate moves, leading his army toward disaster at Saratoga, and the Americans, emboldened by their performance at Freeman's farm, would fight harder, knowing that victory was within their grasp. The Battle of Freeman's Farm was more than a battle, it was a turning point. It was a moment when the world saw that the American dream was worth bleeding for, a spark that would ignite a revolution and change the course of history.